Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Forged webinar, where we will be discussing all the implications of COVID-19, particularly on South Africa, but as well as what is happening across the world. My name is Pontsho Pilane, and I have the pleasure of facilitating this very important conversation that is close to my heart, and also have incredible speakers who will join this discussion too. In this episode, or in this edition rather, of the Forges webinar, we will be discussing food justice and what the implications of COVID-19 on food justice is on a global scale, as well as coming or zoning in into the local scale of things. And to have this very important conversation, I cannot do it by myself. I will have two incredible panelists who will join me, who are experts in this field of food justice, and will share their expertise and their own opinions around this issue. And first off, we have Raj Patel, who's an award-winning author, filmmaker, and academic. He's a research professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin, and he's also a senior research associate at the Unit of Humanities, at the Unit for the Humanities at the university, currently known or still known as Rhodes University here in South Africa. And Raj is also joined by another esteemed guest, Isobel Frye, who's the founding director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute that is based in Johannesburg here in South Africa. And she was a director at a commercial law practice to work for the Black Sash organization as an advocacy manager, and then moved to Naledi as a senior researcher in poverty and socio-economic rights. And as you can see, both speakers, our guests, are very well versed in issues around social and socio-economic rights, particularly when we look at food justice. And particularly today, as we discuss this issue, when we really focus on the reshaping the conversation around food justice, not only during a time of COVID-19 outbreak, but going forward beyond this outbreak, beyond this pandemic, and going into the future. So thank you so much to both our panelists for joining us during such a busy and uncertain time. Raj, welcome, as well as to you, Isobel. And with that note, I think we should just go into the conversation and really talk about where we currently stand. And Isobel, just to bring it home, and then come to you, Raj, about what is happening globally as well as in South Africa. What has been the response to hunger or the lack of food during the pandemic reveal about the political will of the South African government or the global government when it comes to food justice? Isobel, would you like to kick us off?
I will. Thank you very much for that introduction, and also to the Forge for hosting this really critical conversation. I think for me, the question around food security is a really good lens to be able to see where the interests and the class dynamics around transformation and equality are. And I speak specifically about South Africa, although my comments might include some more global directives. I'll speak to three main points. The first one is that prior to COVID, notwithstanding the right to sufficient food in the South African Constitution and other international treaties and instruments, we faced a very high level of starvation. The 2017 Stats SA Poverty Trends Report, which was using 2015 data, showed that 1 in 4 South Africans was food insecure. Their incomes fell below the food poverty line. 1 in 2 South Africans, 55%, more than 1 in 2 South Africans, fell below the upper bound poverty line. For me, I think it's important to recognize that access to food security in South Africa has quite a peculiar basis, and that is, even though we're a developing country, we have a high dependency on cash as a manner of obtaining food, with the result of the 13 Land Act and various other subsequent acts under apartheid, people had their land stolen from them. So it's not a question of having a large base of a rural peasantry who are able to produce their own food. We have a highly urbanized proletariat. And although we have some people living in provinces in the form of Bantustans, we've also seen a deliberate attempt at impoverization to ensure that people were dependent on wage income and therefore were dependent on the kind of slave wages that apartheid brought through. So the first point briefly being that people were food insecure before COVID-19. The second point being that this was a very deliberate policy and that sadly the transformative socio-economic rights and principles of our constitution haven't been successfully met. For me, the response to the COVID outbreak and the state's response specifically has been more focused on short-term humanitarian relief rather than transformative policies which look to the future. So we saw a lot of emphasis by the state, the establishment of the Solidarity Fund, which was really harnessing private sector resources, really revealing themselves in the kind of food relief packages. Now we know that in many instances that food relief, although feeding very necessary needs, also has a secondary impact of destroying long-term food value and production chains. So while people were formerly able to purchase food from a street trader or an informal trader, now the food is coming in from outside, which draws into a sort of critical question, the point about sustainability. So what we had hoped for and have been advocating for was the greater response in terms of a rights-based access to food grants for working age people who are not eligible under the current social security system for some kind of basic income. And although we saw that the president announced on the 21st of April that new forms of income relief through social relief of distress be made available, we have not seen any kind of statement of intent from the Minister of Social Development as to how this happens in a clear and organized way. So just to conclude this round of kind of analysis from my side, we've seen a distinct lack of urgency in terms of addressing the real shortages that go towards making people food insecure in South Africa, notwithstanding the many calls on the state to use this opportunity to transform the various relations of access to food in South Africa in the past.
Wow, Isobel. Pontsho, did you want to jump in? Or?
No, please go right ahead, Raj. I was going to.
Because that's a fantastic framing. I'm going to use that to talk about the global situation. So, as Isobel was saying, things were crappy before this happened, and they were. I mean, the sort of stylized facts are that there were 2 billion people worldwide who were food insecure, and 820 odd million who were malnourished. In the United States, here 1 in 7 Americans were food insecure. And the projections are that that's going to get really rather worse. Just as a sort of as an indication, in 2008, just before the last Great Recession, there were between 30 and 35 million Americans who were food insecure. That number went up to 50, from 35 to 50 over the course of the recession, and it's taken us about 10 years to get back to about 40 million. The projections this time round are far worse, and that's because the scale of economic deprivation is that much worse. Plus, we're seeing in the medium term disruptions to the food supply. We'll get to that in a sec. But suffice to say that if we're interested in food justice, then obviously we have to recognize that the situation before COVID was a deeply unjust one. And as Isobel said, it's a world of intentional and structured injustice. So the interesting thing now is to look at how different governments have responded. In the United States, you've seen the Trump administration sort of soft pedal on some plans to actually cut people off food aid. Before all this broke, there were going to be work requirements to make sure that able-bodied people throw themselves into the workforce. Those rules have been suspended, but they undoubtedly will be back come summer. And those kinds of draconian neoliberal stipulations happen and are being pushed in some of the more egregious neoliberal regimes. On the other hand, you can see states like the Indian state of Kerala, which is already, that sort of leaned into the crisis, has food being produced in sort of communal kitchens and being delivered to people's doors 3 square meals a day. And there is variability. I mean, in other parts of India, people being left to die by the roadside. In the United States, we see, again, great amounts of indifference in some states, whereas in New York City, the school system is providing free meals a day for anyone who wants it. So you're seeing a range of responses, from the sort of decommodification of food, free food for everyone anytime, to letting people suffer and die. And it's been very interesting in the United States, again, the sort of microcosm of extremes, to see on the one hand, a sort of leaning in of socialized food systems and of end-to-end worker-owned, farm-to-table cooperatives flourishing, and on the other hand, the sorts of racist, Nazi flag-waving calls to open up the economy so that the predominantly poor and disproportionately people of color workforce involved in the food system can suffer and die so that rich white people get to have food. So the story of food injustice is one that's just been magnified by this crisis, and it's been really telling. I don't know if the language is the same in South Africa, but in the United States, what we have is this dialogue and this language of essential workers. And who are the essential workers? They're the people who are paid the least in our food system: delivery workers, grocery store clerks, people who are picking food in the fields, people who are washing the dishes, and they are being asked to sacrifice themselves so that the middle class and the rich can continue to make profits and continue to eat in style. And I'm very worried that if we're thinking about what happens next, that we enter into a situation that looks a lot like South Africa. With the arrival of the dispensation, everyone's like, "Oh, it's going to be way better. This changes everything. Everything's going to change. Everything's going to be so much better. Inequality out the window. We're going to have our day. It's going to be fabulous." And the story in South Africa didn't work out quite so well. And I think that the story here is that it's not merely optimism that we require, observing that we're in a moment of transformation, but we do need something much more than that. And maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much to both of you for very enlightening ideas and even facts around what COVID-19 has done. And in past conversations at the Forge, we have really highlighted the fact that what both of you have said in different ways, that what COVID-19 has done for different sectors, including when we look at the availability of food and food security, is it's exacerbated already existing conditions that are unfair, particularly to marginalized people. And when we thank you so much, Raj, for that global picture where we realize, in South Africa, we've seen the images trending of people standing in 4-kilometer long lines waiting for food parcels. That alone in itself is very indicative of the desperation or the level of food insecurity. You also touched on how the New York food system, school system is giving 3 meals a day. Whereas in South Africa right now, there are school or education groups, civil society groups that are fighting for the schooling feeding scheme system to be put back online as schools are closed for a longer period of time. As many learners from poor schools, or what we call the feeding scheme schools or no-fee schools in South Africa, where learners do not pay school fees and get at least 1 meal a day in the school, have been closed for more than the duration they were supposed to be closed for if COVID-19 didn't happen. And we're seeing that potentially 9 million children are going hungry. right? The one meal that they would get. And so in considering this, and also in considering within the context of COVID-19, and as well as the reality that being in contact with people puts us at risk, how do we mitigate food insecurity while prioritizing the safety of people? So how do we avoid the 4-kilometer lines or people rushing out of desperation to areas where it's said to be that's where food parcels or food is going to be collected? How does the government or even the civil society organizations, how can we facilitate the provision of food and food aid in a way that still protects people, particularly in this time of an infectious disease like COVID-19, and where we know that the end is not in sight, as we in South Africa particularly are waiting for a peak, which is said, or epidemiologists have said it will be in September, October. So what happens in the meantime, and what are some of the lessons that we're seeing from different parts that are doing it right, protecting people, the safety of people from the outbreak or from the virus COVID-19, at the same time while ensuring that people don't go hungry and that they're more food secure?
I'm just going to jump in here. I mean, the questions that you throw out are difficult ones. And I think that if we had a solution, we probably wouldn't be talking. I mean, my view is quite located in policy responses. I'd be really interested to hear more from Raj about what's happening in Kerala, because as I'm aware, the responses came about a lot earlier than in many other aspects of the world, and are a lot more inclusive, I think. But just to say from my perspective, you're right. I mean, you've identified the fact that there are huge queues of people just waiting for food. Now, given the global surpluses that exist, and given the technology, this is a scene that, to my mind, should evoke 1940s sort of post-Second World War responses, and not 2020. My own view is firstly that the regulations on informal traders were understandable in terms of the lack of knowledge. But as soon as more information and knowledge came through, it's regrettable that those continued, that the kind of permits that were required for food traders to trade were so slow and forthcoming. I think we need to be aware of the decentralization of access to food, so that you don't have people firstly spending transport money that they don't have in order to get to congested shopping centers, rather than relying on supporting local traders. So I think the decentralization of access, crucially based in support of that, however, is the need to redistribute income. I mean, income is the lifeline. We've been in consultation with a lot of the main banking associations, specifically Banking Association of South Africa, about using the very sophisticated banking architecture that we have, and ensuring that that's made available to people, so that people don't have to be registered in person, but can do it remotely. We saw a great innovation in Namibia, our neighbor, just a couple of weeks ago, where government used the mobile phone system in order to enable people to be registered. So we've seen some advances in that. I mean, my own call on BASA and other organizations that have that reach been to reduce their fees, so that if necessary they cover their costs, but it's certainly not profit oriented. But I think that that's something that needs to be monitored, is the profit creep that the private sector is seeing in this current situation, how they can reach in there and entrench a post-COVID sort of domicile in terms of generating further profits. I think so what I've touched on is expanding access to income, and also access to the purchasing of food. We're aware of the fact that in South Africa, access to land is still a critical urgency, and so people's ability to produce their own, especially as we're going into winter, is something which right now is not, I don't see it as a comprehensive solution that can be changed as we go forward. We've also seen a huge increase in food inflation since the beginning of the year. And I think one of the responses should be that if we are not able to keep food prices affordable, that the state should come in and set administered food prices on certain goods. Now, we've seen that some food items in South Africa are zero rated in terms of the value added tax. That could, though that's certainly not a comprehensive list, that could be the beginning of introducing administered food prices for that. Okay, so I'll stop there. My response is very urban-centered, and it's not looking at collective, holistic responses to going forward. And I think maybe that's where we can sort of, the conversation can flow from here.
Well, let me build on that again, Isobel. Thank you so much for laying that out. I mean, I'm happy to talk about Kerala. I mean, the lesson from Kerala is that it helps to have a communist government. The other lesson from Kerala is that it helps to have a government that is, at a modicum competent, that has not been, atrophying the organs of the state, that has been building up its capacity for public health care. That has and knows how to deploy members of the government and a vast sort of phalanx of state employees to do things like contact tracing, to do things like welfare checks, to do things like dropping in on communities and running through questions like, well, how are you feeling? What do you need? How can we help? And having a government that does that kind of thing often helps. They've also got the capacity to be able to do centralized cooking. So they're using schools and hospitals, government-owned enterprises, to create and to cook and distribute millions of meals, not just for Keralans, but for the migrant workers who are there. And I think this is a sort of crucial aspect, particularly in South Africa, where so many people in Southern Africa depend on remittances from South Africa. And with the lockdown, that's having massive ripple effects throughout the region, as you know. So I think having a supportive state apparatus helps. It's a bit late for that now in South Africa, isn't it? So what's the response? Well, I mean, meeting the dignified emergency that exists among the poor right now is definitely the way to go. And I do think that insofar as there are institutions like hospitals and schools that can fall under the public trust, or that can be made public, that they can and should be repurposed to the task of providing welfare, certainly in terms of food and in terms of income. But I take your point also that, Isobel, income is not enough. Assets are important as well. And South Africa still has a rather large task of asset redistribution that matters there. One of the interesting examples that I've been hearing is from, I was speaking to some comrades in Mexico yesterday, and what they're very interested in is thinking about a sort of more medium-term response. These colleagues were part of a sort of cadre of food service workers, and they are still they're still employing themselves. So they're still getting checks, even though they're not doing work, because they saved up and because a few people are selling food from their homes to their neighbors and doing deliveries. But what they're suggesting is that in the medium to long term, what we need is a transformation in who owns the supply chain. Because certainly in the United States, I don't know if you've been hearing, but these long supply chains that depend on food from over here being distributed to cities over there, they're breaking because they're fragile, because they were always meant to be fragile. When you produce food just in time, when you're following this neoliberal model of not having stores, not having supplies or backup, because you always assume that the world market will provide. Well, you have those very thin, very fragile supply chains that depend on an empire of logistics. But one small break in those chains and people stop being fed in the cities. So the model for cities, these colleagues in Mexico City are saying is, look, we can't rely on these long supply chains. What we need is much shorter supply chains, which means worker ownership from farm to fork. And what that means is shifting away from these large industrial models of production, where you can have, 10,000 hectares of soybeans over here, and then being shipped to this particular animal feeding operation and one slaughterhouse that provides for these particular supplies of meat. You can't do that anymore. You need much more distributed and, as you were saying, decentralized models of production, but that are backstopped by the state, so that if there is a break in the supply chain, there's always someone to pick up the pieces. But one break in the supply chain won't leave an entire city without food, or South Africa's case, electricity, or whatever it is. So I think the model that we're seeing is a concern, particularly driven by workers, that I'm seeing around the world where there is success of wanting to seize back power. And they're having to fight back against shareholders that are very keen to put them to work. I mean, here in the United States, one of our biggest hotspots was a meat processing plant. And that's not surprising. The number of meat processing plants have been dwindling, and they've been held increasingly in the hands of the few large corporations that do this business, like Tyson and JBS, the Brazilian corporation. So if we imagine what that looks like, either we see an increased consolidation, as we saw after the last Great Recession. We saw increased consolidation in the food system, workers being paid less, people being asked, workers being demanded to work more and work without benefits. And that's certainly a plausible outcome this time round. But again, from the places that seem to be doing things quite well, the demand is a redistribution of power, of income and assets. And for those assets to be placed in workers' hands with a state that's competent enough to be able to provide the support that those workers and those cooperatives need in order to be able to feed everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Raj. And again, you kind of both of you guys encapsulate the conversation so clearly. But for me, as a South African citizen, as well as a journalist sitting here, particularly looking at the South African situation, where Raj has stressed the importance of a competent government, right? And in South Africa, where we have issues around corruption and where aid is often hijacked by greedy politicians and their friends. How do we mitigate against that? But not just for this era in which we are operating in right now. But we also have this notion of, you slightly touched on migrant workers, where a lot of the food or the relief, the socio-economic relief that is coming out of South Africa is very nationalistic, where it's South Africans, right? And where, as you've rightfully said, that we have a very large migrant community in South Africa, where a lot of informal work is done by migrant laborers, and now they have been kind of excluded from the socio-economic reliefs that the government is talking about. And in those states, also further perpetuating a level of stigma to even kind of test or protect yourself, or even talk about the fact that you find yourself hungry in a situation like this because you might be undocumented, or, as the government will always say, illegal, as if people can be illegal in one way or the other. How do we make sure that how do we hold a government accountable? A government that has proven not to be accountable before. We've seen a lot of proactive actions from the South African government. Just yesterday on Twitter, I was seeing the Minister of Human Settlements talk about houses that were built in the 6 weeks in which we've been in the outbreak. There's been people who've been waiting for houses since '94. And so we're seeing a rapid response to the responsibility, the uptake of responsibility from the government perspective, and also pressuring private sector to also kind of be more responsible and socially responsible, which is a whole other discussion. But how do we, this is a very tricky balance that we need to get, especially if we want to ensure that the lessons learned, or some of the procedures or the aids that are put in place during this time of the outbreak carry on in a post-COVID-19 world. Should it take, in short, should it take a pandemic to have so much action and responsibility to provide for people, particularly marginalized people in our country or in the world, as we're seeing right now?
An interesting point. Does it need to take such a crisis to catalyze change? It seems that it does. For me, your question about how we hold power accountable is a really interesting one. I'm not a sociologist, as you mentioned in the introduction. I'm a lawyer, which is usually a terrible articulation of the defense of the status quo. But I left law, but it stays with me. So one of the things that I've been really interested in is seeing the reemergence of local networks. So for many of us, we grew up under the banner of the UDF, the United Democratic Front, which was sort of broad, it's probably before you were born. But it was basically an umbrella of local structures, going down to street committees, advice offices, and sort of building up to regional, provincial, and national organizations. We know that there was a demobilization of the UDF after 1994. I've been really interested, and again, it depends on local assets and resources as to the strength of organizing, but that really has been a response. I spoke to a number of leaders in the South African Council of Churches in the early weeks of the pandemic. We haven't seen a very visible presence of the SACC again since 1994. So it's interesting how both faith-based, so organizations, leaders have come forward, but ordinary people have been organizing themselves. And that, to my mind, really is where the solution lies. I've been very aware of the fact that in South Africa, a lot of the ways in which we challenge power, we have challenged power traditionally, have been through structures such as organized labor. And where I am at NEDLAC in terms of a sort of social dialogue platform, it's been, I've noted the frustration of organized labor because a traditional tool or weapon has been striking. But when you're not within when you're not on the factory floor, that's not a tool that you can use. And so lockdown is very similar to a sort of a lockout. And so when people's power in the sense of bodies on the street or sort of passive resistance is removed, how then do we hold people accountable? And so the role of social media for me has been quite critical, both in terms of organizing people's views. And as you say, this can have both a negative as well as a positive characteristic. So we have seen xenophobia being articulated, but we've also seen people coming forward and saying, but actually, that's not necessarily the way that we should be progressing, and linking in with other sort of views globally. That's really broken down the sense of isolation that we sometimes are characterized by. So I think the shift is there, and I'm not sure how that is taken towards a progressive conclusion. We are hamstrung by our traditional sort of tools. And we need to be very conscious about the ways that we move forward, and that we tell people in power that this is how we are shifting, so that it's not a sort of catch. And just my final point is, we talk about holding the state to account, but it's also the private sector. I mean, Raj was talking about the kind of the collusion of people, of the business interests. And in South Africa, we see that from the owning of the farms of production to the transport, to the milling, and to the final distribution, so that it's much cheaper to buy a loaf of bread from Sasco, which is made somewhere centrally, than it is to bake for you and sell to your neighborhood. So right now, I think it's just about bringing attention to that. I know that the Competition Commission has been quite active recently in proactively identifying those rather than just waiting for complaints. But I think appealing to the decency, it's a term that struck me about 2 weeks ago, just operating as a decent person, and recognizing that the person that your humanity rests in recognizing other people's humanity. It sounds very kumbaya, but I think in terms of a revolution, it's starting with recognizing our role in the broader humanity.
Thank you, Isobel. I couldn't agree more. We find ourselves in the middle of a moment where all of a sudden most of our work is about care. It's about care for elders, for children, for one another, for figuring out ways of making sure that people in our neighborhoods are taken care of. And it's an opportunity to push back against the kind of chauvinism that had infiltrated the political discourse. But it's also it's entirely compatible with the fascists and the Nazis coming out again, as we see here in the United States. One of the things that is interesting about this crisis, though, to get to Pontsho, your point about does it take a crisis? What's interesting about this is that the rich are being affected. And that's very different from, say, the climate crisis or the hunger crisis that we had before this. 2 billion people food insecure was fine. The rich didn't give a shit. But here is a moment to make them feel some pain. And insofar as there isn't an ability to strike, that's a worry for them. But that's why they're sponsoring these kind of right-wing groups saying, oh no, we must open up the economy immediately so that America can be great again. It's the billionaires who need this economy to start up again and need a return to normal. Insofar as we can resist that, and we're seeing excellent examples of people striking against Amazon and Whole Foods and Instacart and all these other kind of gig economies, that's a moment for actually taking back some of the space for striking, even if it's striking in a way, it's striking without a union. And that opening of the space of imagination is what I think is very important to hold on to right now. And I love the idea of a front. Well, one of the things that is being built around the world is a front for things like a Green New Deal. Because the climate crisis hasn't decided to go away just because we're indoors. The climate crisis is still a real thing and needs genuine politics and transformation in order to address it. The organizing to build the demand for a Green New Deal involves stitching together unions and environmentalists and animal rights people, uncomfortable bedfellows across the food system and across what passes for the economy. I think that the moment for that front, it would have been much better to have that front built already, but we have to build it while we need it. And one of the ideas that's coming up, certainly here in the United States, is not a Green New Deal, but a green stimulus. As we emerge out of this dire economy, the idea of targeting government resources specifically at low-income communities, that communities that have suffered the greatest of these injustices and need to be rebuilt in order to be able to flourish in the wake of COVID and under the COVID economy, which will last still for a good few months yet. That idea of a new green stimulus is something that can both be a vehicle for and a recruitment tool in order to be able to develop this popular front and the politics that are required. And I see a role for unions here, but also groups like and for movements of people across South Africa, across the world. But it does need that politics of confrontation with capitalism and with the bourgeoisie in particular, because this is a moment where they've suffered unlike any moment before. And when it goes away, they will pretend like the climate crisis isn't really affecting them. They'll get on their planes and they'll bugger off again. But this is a moment because they can feel pain. They should, and they must feel what it's like to be held accountable by workers, by communities of carers, by those who've been marginalized by their politics. And this can be a moment of reinvention.
Thank you so much to both Isobel and Raj for sharing incredible views and very eye-opening perspectives on how to kind of take the food justice conversation forward now and in the future. Particularly some of the points that really resonated with me as we're having this conversation is the idea of a competent state, right? A state that serves the people in which it governs, rather, or the people that put it into governing. And also that food justice and achieving food justice and giving food aid is a very intersectional process. It is neither for the economy or giving people money through grants, or is it's a very, very multifaceted procedure where it deals with the issues of fundamentally changing the social, the economic, and the political configurations of a state or of the world as we know it, and prioritizing really, as Isobel frankly said, I know you said you think it sounds very cheesy, but really seeing people for the people that they are, you know, as kumbaya as it sounds, at the core of justice, any kind of justice, including food justice, is seeing people for who they are and valuing their humanity for simply the existence. And this conversation, we could speak for 3 hours about the importance of food justice, particularly in the world that we live in, as the inequalities that exist in the world continue to exacerbate under the pandemic. But I'd just like to thank both of you, Raj Patel, who's a filmmaker, author, and an academic, and as well as Isobel Frye, who is the founding director of the Studies of Poverty, who is the founding director of the Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute that is based here in Johannesburg, around the conversation that we just had, which is about reshaping food justice for the present and the future, and how to convince our politicians and those who have the power to change the world, including the private sector, on how to make this a more just world, particularly where people are not living in food insecure situations. With that, I would like you guys, if you have any parting thoughts, to share them with us as we round up this discussion. Thank you again to the Forge for allowing us to have this conversation, particularly during this time. You know, thank God for technology and being able to connect while we physically distance, but we are socially aware and we're socially not keeping away from each other. So with that, the Forge, thank you to the Forge team for affording me, Pontsho Pilane, again, the opportunity to host and facilitate this conversation. And I don't want to be the last person to say something. I'd like our esteemed panel to have the last word as we wrap up this conversation. So Raj, Isobel, over to you with your parting 1 minute about where to from here.
That's not fair, 1 minute. I think that you highlighted the ongoing necessity for us not to see this crisis just on an immediate basis, but as a medium to long term. I was really interested in what Raj was beginning to talk about the new Green Deal. And I think one of the challenges that we have in a state of such need as we have in South Africa, given the inequalities, is that we silo our approaches to our responses. And I know that there are a number of really good minds thinking. I think we need to, the other thing that I'll take back is just the real importance of locating solutions in the lived reality of people whose insecurity we're talking about. And so thank you very much for those challenges. I've got a lot to go back, think about, and to really start spreading along the networks that I'm engaging in. And thanks to the Forge for this opportunity, and to you, Pontsho, for your elegant holding of the conversation.
Yes, thank you, Pontsho, and thank you, the Forge, and thank you, Isobel, for just schooling me on the possibilities and situation in South Africa at the moment. And for me, I mean, I think the key idea here is to be grounded in the realities of folk who are fighting this. And again, folk have been fighting this for a while. It's not new, and to take their leadership seriously, and to follow what it is that groups like La Via Campesina, the International Peasant Movement, are offering, or Abahlali Basemjondolo, or Food Chain Workers Alliance, the International Union of Food Workers. All of these folk have websites and they have good ideas, and many of them are involved in the visions for a Green New Deal that will deal not just with hunger and with injustice, but also think about the climate crisis and think about the world that we need to be in terms of energy, housing, work, health by the year 2030. Those are big visions, but they're all tied up together in how it is that we eat and take care of one another. And that, let's follow the leadership that's been demanding this kind of change since before the pandemic. The least we can do is follow it afterwards.